ahead. See if I can get their attention. Two espressos. So we were reading the idea of Freud's essay,
Freud, yeah.
Thoughts and Reflections on Death and War. I mean, it's
really,
quite of a brilliant piece that he writes
really
in the midst of
amazing,
the war, 1915. Difficult to know where to start. One is sort of in awe and the kind of reflection he's capable of producing.
It really kind of, for me, it really struck a chord with the idea of the war as something of a revelation. Yeah. And there's something really sad about that, because it's not something that you want to realize, but in a way it confirms what he'd investigated, and it justifies his analyses beforehand. That's not something that's easy to accept.
Yes.
And I mean, and that's a real theme in the essay, is this a truth that's very hard to accept, but nonetheless is maybe better that it's been revealed as such.
Yeah, and I think that's the key, sort of plot, that a diagnosis of what has come to an end, what is this profound disillusionment in European culture. So that's the first part of this reflections, the question of disillusionment, what have we lost?
Yeah.
And then that leads into the second thing that's fascinating for Freud, is that part of this disillusionment is a moment of revelation that reveals something about our relationship to death.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the inability to have a certain relationship to death is itself the cause for the crisis of modernity, the First World War. And that's the moment that there might be something to be learned about our relationship to death and life from this experience of mass death, which of course is the First World War.
Yeah, and one thing that really stands out is that for him, morality and individual morality is dependent upon the state. But what's really shocked him about the way the war has been conducted is it's the immorality of states, the hypocrisy. And that in a way tears the foundation away from individual morality, which was grounded upon it being manifested in the state.
Yeah, that's. I think the hypocrisy is the key term. I mean, the sense in which European nation states, because it's also interesting that he makes the difference between primitive and European, and says, look, primitive societies are warring each other, but the aspiration of Europe is to a kind of cosmopolitanism. And this involves a kind of state that takes on the charge of educating and the moral upbringing of individuals. And then what strikes him as hypocritical is the way in which now nation states in the First World War are behaving in brutal ways to each other as primitives, and then that then is a context in which individuals themselves can sink to a level of brutality. And so there's a kind of regression to primitivism that he diagnoses, and that's the profound sense of disillusionment, that this aspiration for a culture is empty.
There was almost a belief that the history of the repression of instincts would have built something stronger. And I mean, he has this phrase where he says one would have expected a war between European nations to be a chivalrous passage of arms, and it's anything but that. It's absolutely brutal and shows just how fragile the civilization has been.
Great.
There you go. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Looks great. And I think that's also this idea that for Freud is important, that there's a kind of mechanism of the state. And the mechanism of the state is to inhibit and control certain drives, which themselves, as he says, are neither good or evil. So we have these sort of drives that need satisfaction. They are themselves neither good or evil, and then the function of education, of laws, of duty, sociality as such is an inhibition. But precisely the paradox of this mechanism of inhibition is that it itself then produces a culture which itself in turn is capable of unleashing this kind of violence, which then is a regressive movement to a kind of primitivism. And that's a very complex set of thought that he tries to articulate in this first sense of disillusionment.
Oh yeah, great.
I mean, the other thing that I think is, and this might be the transition to the second part of the essay, is that this whole diagnosis of the disillusionment, the hypocrisy of culture, is then substantially connected to a relationship to death. And this quite interesting idea that though we all know in one sense that we are going to die, in our unconscious we believe ourselves to be immortal. And so then the unconscious belief in the immortality of the self manifests itself as the attempt to eliminate death from life.
Yeah.
And that's a kind of paradox of death, that no one accepts that they will die.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then the primitive, what he calls the primitive man,
Mhm.
has this much more complex, ambiguous relationship
Yeah.
to death.
He talks about the rituals, like after a battle, if a primitive warrior had killed people, he would not be allowed back into the village, and there was a much more felt sense of the gravity of death, whereas it seems to be more easily brushed off and brushed under the carpet. Really.
Yeah, in modern's kind of
Yeah.
the denial of death
Yeah.
thesis. And there the idea that the so-called primitive has a kind of contradictory attitude towards death because
Mhm.
they believe themselves to be immortal,
Yeah.
but then have an attitude towards the death of the others, so not family, kin, as something which is completely acceptable.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then Freud then has this really interesting observation where he says this is the secret of what it is to be a hero. To be a hero is not to die for one's country, to die for a value, but to regress to this primitive state where I think
Yeah.
I'm immortal,
Yeah.
at the price of recognizing that the death of others is meaningless.
Yeah.
And so I can
Yeah.
kill others and not fear anything because of this contradictory attitude that I have. And it's precisely this contradictory attitude which, in a sense, is revealed in the war.
Yeah. Yeah.
This
It's a-
ambivalence of I can be very brutal to others and believe myself immortal.
Yeah, he really demystifies sacrifice, that it's actually a return to your bestial drives.
Yeah, and that's a nice way to put it, that it's a
Yeah.
kind of demystification of sacrifice. And of course,
Yeah.
sacrifice was crucial for patriotism, etc.
Yeah, yeah. It's nothing to do with ideals. It's rather about he describes sleep as being disrobed of our morality, and in a way, the war is like a waking nightmare or something,
Yes,
where
yeah.
we're reverted back to just drives and instincts that can look like heroism from the outside when they're seen through the eyes of the everyday, but actually in the war, it's
Yeah.
something much more primal.
That's the Joyce, right? History is a nightmare that we are trying to awake
Yeah,
from.
yeah, yeah.
Maybe one last thought, of course it's quite a complex essay, very rich, is what you were talking about at the beginning, that this disillusionment, this unveiling of our relationship to death, this regression to a primitive state of existence. At the end of the essay, there is a sense that there could be something learned, if you wish,
Yeah.
from a psychological, psychoanalytical point of view, that perhaps this denial of death,
Yeah.
which is the basis for, let's call it modern culture, is one of the causes for the propensity for modern culture to unleash this kind of
Yeah.
violence.
Yeah.
And so he suggests at the end that maybe we need to accept death.
Yeah.
And so in a sense, the way in which to have a form of life which would avoid this collapse, disillusionment, is a changed attitude towards death that doesn't try to deny it,
Yeah. Yeah.
but understand the ambivalence of our attitude towards death.
Yeah, if you want to endure life, prepare yourself for death.
That's
it
right.
could be the route to something more healthy.
And that could be sort of the kind of motto that he places for the future,
Yeah.
the future after the First World War.
Which then is what's really sad about the essay, because I mean at the beginning he says, we stand here without a glimmering of the future that is being shaped, but you realize that actually what happens over the next 30 years is just far worse than anything that he's seen, and only confirms more and more deeply the pessimistic realization that the First World War has brought about is fully manifested in the Second.
Yeah, and that would be, I guess, another topic of conversation.
Yeah.
Freud's development in the 20s and 30s and the tragic
Yeah.
circumstances for Freud himself
Yeah.
After the Nazis take over Austria, is sent into exile.
Yeah.
Maybe another time.
Yeah. Definitely.